This is chapter 14, which I didn't realize, but is the last chapter. Everybody goes home. It was really sad after that. Mrs. Witherspoon was crying so hard that Evie and Bert decided to drive her home, and we stayed with her while Evie made her a pot of tea and something to eat because she hadn't eaten all day. We all sat around the kitchen table while Mrs. Witherspoon ate scrambled eggs and reminisced about growing up with Miss Perfidy, and Evie worked on her macrame and drank tea, and Bert and I have to admit, pretty much just sat there. I thought how strange it was after a death when everyone is kind of stunned. Mrs. Witherspoon, I am sure, would never normally sit and eat eggs in front of a bunch of strangers without offering them anything, too. And then, when she was done with her eggs, there was a long silence while we just watched Evie work on her macrame as though for all the world that's why we were there. Finally, Miss Witherspoon said to Evie, "What is that you're doing?" "Macrame," said Evie cheerfully. "I'm making a plant hanger to replace some things of ours that got burnt up in a fire. In the worst of times, I find there's always something useful you can do with your hands." Then some other people started arriving to comfort Mrs. Witherspoon, so we said goodbye. It was early evening and a long drive back to Coal Harbor, but we stopped at Goodwill on the way out of town when we saw by the lights that they were still open to see if we could find any of my sweaters. None of them were there, which didn't surprise me. They were very nice sweaters. I hope the children wearing them appreciated that they were hand knit. The week before Christmas, Uncle Jack got out of the hospital, and he and I took long therapeutic walks on the beach. He was still in a lot of pain and walked very, very slowly, but Malamar and I didn't mind. We were so glad to have him back. Despite the pain and the lawsuits and his failing business, he was chipper. "How can you stay so cheery?" I asked. "Things are looking up," he said. "Electrician admitted to the sheriff today that he cut corners to make a bigger profit himself, so at least I'm clear of that." "Well, I guess that's good news," I said. "But your development project is kind of sunk, isn't it?" "Oh, too early to tell. But if it is, it wouldn't be the first time, Primrose." He picked up a rock and skipped it across the water. It skipped 7 times. He was an amazing stone skipper. The most I had ever gotten was 4. The gray winter surf was barreling in. The waves crashed, and the wind tangled my hair and roared in my ears. Malamar had stopped chasing birds for the last few weeks. She was an older and wiser puppy and knew she couldn't catch them. That's why it surprised me when suddenly off she went, as though she had been shot out of a cannon, flying down the beach, her feet barely visible on the sand. Over logs she dove, through surf, changing directions in a split second in midair. "Why does she do that?" I asked Uncle Jack as we watched her in admiration. "She knows she can't catch them." "Oh, just for the sheer joy of the motion," said Uncle Jack. Then we waved to Evie and Bert, who were hobbling over the boulders, tripping down to us on the beach. "Hallo, hallo," they called. Uncle Jack had sent them off to walk by a likely-looking mobile home he was selling. He said he thought he could get them a deal. "It's a charmer," said Bert, as they came panting up to us, all excited. "It's bigger than I thought it would be." "It's big, but not too big," said Evie, "so that we can drive it comfortably down to Arizona, when your Uncle Jack gets custody again of you, which we all know he's going to do as soon as Miss Honeycutt drops her lawsuit." "Or is proven wrong in a court of law," said Bert. "Or is proven wrong in a court of law. Speak of the devil," said Evie, and we all looked because Miss Honeycutt was walking down the waterfront road carrying shopping bags. School would let out soon, and Miss Honeycutt would be leaving to spend her usual 2 weeks in Europe. As we looked, she bumped right smack into Miss Bowser, who was hustling down the street, turning the corner without looking, an industrial-sized can of mustard in her arms. There was a moment of confusion while they bumped heads. Sheriff Peters was ambling by, and he bent over and picked up and handed the packages to Miss Honeycutt, who was frowning and didn't even seem to say thank you. And then Miss Bowser spied us and waved. I can still see the whole scene, detail by detail, because of what happened next. A boat chugged by and started heading in for the main pier, and we all turned around to look. It wasn't a fishing boat, and we couldn't imagine what kind of fool would take a pleasure boat out on such wild waters. But the people on the deck were standing against the rail, looking excitedly to shore, as if, for all the world, they were on a cruise. And I saw that it was my parents, and at the same time saw everyone's reaction as if I were filming it all in slow motion. Miss Bowser dropped the cigarette right out of her mouth. Miss Honeycutt looked horrified, as if she had made some terrible mistake and didn't know what to do about it. Evie and Bert were looking at me because I was making gacking noises, and Uncle Jack simply rolled his eyes back and fainted dead away on the sand. Well, he was still pretty ill. I looked down at him in astonishment as the sheriff ran over to us. Sheriff Peters was cool as a cucumber, as always, and immediately began first aid. Miss Bowser dashed over next and held Uncle Jack's head up out of the muck, saying to me, "The sheriff and I have him. Go on, go on." So I flew across the sand, but as I was running, I was thinking that all along I had thought Uncle Jack believed, as I did, that my parents were still alive because he never ever once contradicted me. But now I knew that all along he had been certain they were dead. And, as happy as I was to see my parents again, the most prominent emotion I had at that moment was just overwhelming gratitude because he had stood at my side all those months, keeping the faith even when he didn't believe it himself. My parents ended up in the Comox Hospital because they were emancipated and needed to be checked out. During that first week, we were told our stories, and I showed them my missing digits. My mother said that when she had set out in our skiff, she really had no hope of finding my father, but she pushed on and on into the storm. She came up upon his boat finally. It was taking on a lot of water from both sides, and he was just inflating the dinghy when he spied her. She tried to bring her boat into his, but collided against the side and fell overboard. My father threw the dinghy with 2 survival suits into the water and abandoned the fishing boat. He managed to finally get my mother on board the dinghy, help her get her raincoat off, which blew over the side, and put her survival suit on her. But she had gotten wet enough that he was worried about hypothermia. Finally, they were flung, he said, almost airborne through the waves until they crashed against some rocks on an island. It wrecked the dinghy, but they were alive, and they crept onto land where they had lived very much like Robinson Crusoe all this time. They were disoriented by the storm, so my father wasn't exactly sure where they were, but he knew they couldn't be that far out of the range of small craft that might sail in close enough to spot them. So they took turns all this time watching. They were finally spotted by a couple who rescued them, who had rented a boat to look for grizzly bears. At first, they thought my parents were grizzly bears and motored in to get a closer look and were surprised to see 2 gaunt, savage-looking people. "But now you're home," said Evie. "Does anyone want a mint?" "Oh, how lovely, mints." My mother and then my parents had to go off and rest, and Uncle Jack and Evie and Bert and I drove back home, where Uncle Jack was relocating the couple who had rented our house to another house for free, although they said they would have moved anyway. My parents were a seventh-day wonder in Cole Harbor that week. I ran into Miss Honeycutt on the street the day after my parents got out of the hospital. She immediately started speaking 6 to the dozen. "So I guess you're happy your parents are home again. Quite an amazing thing. I'm happy for you, Primrose. I imagine you're feeling very grateful." I was. Not just for their return, but for their absence, too, and where it had taken me and who I had met there. I would never go home again in quite the same way, but that was okay, too. I was feeling so grateful that I expansively invited Miss Honeycutt to join us that evening at the Girl on the Red Swing. My parents were taking Evie and Bert and Uncle Jack and me to dinner to celebrate, and somehow I suddenly felt sorry for Miss Honeycutt, who was always so alone. She jabbed on as usual, but this time I made myself pay attention. "Thank you very much, but I'm afraid I'm unable to make it. You see, I'm flying out of Cole Harbor tonight. I got the unfortunate news yesterday that my father has passed away at last, and so, of course, I plan to return to England, as I have always planned to do, to take over the manor house and attend to things. First, I shall see my father's many friends around Europe, which I quite prefer to having them all attend a funeral. No, it will be a small private funeral, and I shall spend the winter months in Capri visiting the godparents and father's good friends in Paris, and then on to Germany and Austria for the cousins, after that to Denmark and Amsterdam because there are some exhibitions I wish to see. Do you know Vermeer? No, I said. Pity, she said. Well, I shan't be returning to Cole Harbor. And then she did something odd. She reached down and grabbed my hand and shook it briefly. A cold, hard, lifeless shake, and turned around, and I never saw her again. All my life I had wanted to travel, but what I discovered that year was that the things that you find out become the places that you go, and sometimes you find them out by getting jettisoned oft alone, and other times it is the people who choose to stand by your side who give you the clues. But the important things that happen to you will happen to you even in the smallest places, like Cole Harbor. I thought of Lena and her potatoes, and wondered whether if she had sat tight, they would have happened to be her here too. 2 years later, my mother got a Christmas card from Lena, saying she was divorced now and practicing law, that James was still a genius, and that Ryan was a handful, but she had him in therapy, and thanking my mother for her help that day. She added that she had gotten the blue ribbon for the best boiled potato. No one, she said, had ever asked her how she had done in the contest. So I stopped envying Miss Honeycutt, who traveled so many places with eyes wide shut, and hoped someday she would look next to her and find someone to whom she could bear to listen. We never any of us heard from her again, although her friends kept expecting an invitation to the manor house, even 2 years after her departure. She left so quickly she had one of her friends at the school tidy up her Cole Harbor affairs and ship what she wanted and sell the rest. After that, the friend never got a postcard from her, much less an invitation. No, we all disappeared clean out of her mind. Or perhaps not, because perhaps we became anecdotes on the other side of the ocean. That night, as planned, we all went for dinner at the Girl on the Red Swing. We asked Miss Bowser to join us. She couldn't because she was busy cooking, but she came in right before we ordered, opened Uncle Jack's menu for him, and stabbed a finger at it, pointing to something. Uncle Jack, startled, looked down to see where she was pointing, and then a long smile spread across his face. Of all the smiles I had seen on Uncle Jack's face, this was the best. "Why, Miss Bowser, I'll be a monkey's uncle," he said, which was pretty inadequate and goes to show how rattled he was. But Miss Bowser seemed satisfied. She smiled and turned her heel to head back to the kitchen. We all flipped through our menus surreptitiously to see what she had pointed to, while Uncle Jack beamed into his, unaware of us apparently. I was the only one who knew what it was when I saw it. It was a new item, air-dried beef and marinated lentils on a bed of radicchio. Uncle Jack ordered it, and it wasn't until he had eaten halfway through it that he saw the waffle underneath. And it was always like that in Cole Harbor. Some people got old, and some died. I left parts of myself some places and found others unexpectedly. New people appeared on the scene, and others disappeared before I had a chance to say goodbye. All kinds of ordinary people gave their whole hearts to things you wouldn't think you could give your hearts to. I made discoveries like the reason for Miss Honeycutt's anecdotes, and other things, like the whereabouts of my sweaters, remained a mystery forever. And Cole Harbor never became a big resort or swank tourist spot or anything. But I didn't care, because I knew that as long as you lived where you could get anything you wanted, as long as you could live there, you could get anything you wanted. And it always came on a waffle. Recipe to follow. Waffles. Mix 2 cups of flour, 1 tablespoon baking powder, 2 tablespoons sugar, half tablespoon salt, In another bowl, put 3 large and well-beaten eggs, 1/2 stick of butter, and 1 1/2 cups of milk. Make a hole in the middle of your dry ingredients and pour in the wet ingredients and stir it all up. Make sure your waffle iron is hot and greased if it is the type that is supposed to be greased, and then pour in enough batter so that it spreads all over, but not quite to the edge, or it will end up leaking out the sides and making a big mess. If you have an electric waffle iron, it will tell you when the waffles are done. Otherwise, you must check them and turn the iron on the burner until the waffle is brown. Serve with butter and syrup. Or, if you are at the Girl in the Red Swing, everything. There you go. The end of our book. Your final question is just, what did you think? Did you love it? Did you like it? Did you not really like it? What did you like about it? Would you recommend it to someone else? Should I read it to my class next year? And why? I will explain our end of book assignment in another place, but I'll give you a hint. We're going to use the recipes.